Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison is away this week. He's en route to Chartres for the Ubiquity University annual pilgrimage, and will be rejoining us again on Thursday. Today is the summer solstice. It's all about light, celebrating the external light in the Northern Hemisphere and the inner light in the Southern Hemisphere. This is an opportunity to open our sensitivities, emotions, intuition, insight, and clarify our priorities in life. It's an opportunity to check our inner alignment. The solstice marks a transition time from one state to another, which can create a portal for new intentions. I invite you to trust the intelligence of your heart, shed the layers that keep you from showing up fully, and do something new, different, and adventurous. It's also a restorative time to honor what you need to support self-care. Be open to the nurturing available to you from others and the sources that support you. Celebrate the solstice in a way that makes sense to you, and pay attention to what's leaving and what's coming in without resistance, judgment, guilt, attachment, or expectation. This inner wisdom makes us uniquely human. This week, we're exploring artificial intelligence in alignment with human interest, human intelligence, and human wisdom. Monday, we explored potential opportunities to harness AI as an augmented intelligence. Yesterday, we discussed the critical need for ethical and compassionate AI. In both broadcasts, we reinforced the underlying need to establish industry self-regulation, oversight, and alignment. Before we move into today's discussion, I invite you all to take a few moments to breathe. Please take an in-breath for about 5.5 seconds when Georg puts up the art card, and when you hear the chime, exhale for about 5.5 seconds. We'll repeat this for about 10 breaths and then get into today's program. Thank you, Georg. I'd like to invite you to come in and just share some of your thoughts about this week and about AI.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, welcome everyone. It's great to have you all on board for this third day in our first AI week here at Humanity Rising. I'm very excited about the subject of education because as Humanity Rising is sponsored by Ubiquity University. It is just a topic that I've been really trying to bring forth in the conversation in our team, and have done a lot of thinking about as we're looking ahead here. And so I just want to use maybe 10 or 15 minutes to frame this conversation, so that we hopefully have a common frame of reference to approach this vast subject. So I want to share my screen, you guys. Let me know if this works. Can you see the tweet by the infamous Elon Musk? Yes? No? Yes, you can. Okay, great. So I think to many people, the connection between education and AI was first made by this weird tweet that Elon made pretty early on, where he said, "It's a new world, goodbye homework." And that's, of course, a pretty horrifying statement, or a very happy statement to many students. But what does it actually mean, right? What is this new world? And why should this be the end of homework anyway? So to dig deeper here in this conversation and connect it to the bigger topic of AI alignment, let's take a step further. And let's say that what we're doing here is we talk about generative AI in education. So systems like ChatGPT, what do they do with our current model of education, right? And how does this technology challenge the current scheme of much of what is going on in education, especially in the early years of schooling, which is in a way a knowledge transfer scheme, right? The overall idea of what education should be, to a large degree, is that we transfer knowledge from a textbook or a teacher into the mind of a student. And as we know, many of the ideas that are still determining the way education is done for kids in Western Europe and in America is this idea of industrializing education and alphabetization on a large scale that was necessary in the Industrial Revolution, where we had a lot of young folks and explosion of the population that needed to become factory workers very soon and very rapidly. And we're still kind of carrying this baggage in much of what's going on in our educational system. And in this midst, when the GPT revolution started last November, what happened was that there were several kind of teams that formed in the world of education. And we can say there are like three different teams, and I call them a team avoid, which is a sector of the education world that says we're going to avoid everything or anything that has to do with artificial intelligence at all costs, meaning we basically go back to writing by hand. We will not do any assessment, any tests where computers are involved. We will lock our students into a clinical room and let them write their papers by hand, and that will be the only manner of assessing their competencies. Then there is Team Bennett, which decided that they were going to use artificial intelligence to find out if their students had used artificial intelligence in their work. This is, of course, a very ironic undertaking. And when you read the latest papers on it, and there are some great people on LinkedIn that I follow, it is actually very difficult at this point to determine wholeheartedly with over 80% of certainty that a text has been written by artificial intelligence or not. In fact, it is often the case that non-native English speakers are flagged as having used artificial intelligence, even though in these tests they were just people who did not use the English language in a way that would be normal for native speakers. So there is a type of bias of these detection mechanisms. And soon enough, it will be absolutely impossible. So Team Bennett has a difficult road ahead to detect the usage of artificial intelligence. And of course, in a situation where Google and Google Docs and Microsoft Word is bringing actively in this technology of completing texts and changing texts, becomes very fine line where a paper that has been co-piloted or co-created by AI is still original thinking or not. So difficult subject. And then there is, of course, a team embrace that acknowledges the presence and potential of AI in education and seeks to educate students about it and maybe even take AI as an opportunity to overcome certain limitations in the education system that are now more obvious than ever. And what do I mean with more obvious than ever? Well, let's have a brief look at this complex pyramid that you may know. It is this idea by Benjamin Bloom, this very famous Bloom's taxonomy, right? So that there are certain layers of learning or levels of learning that build upon each other. And if we look at what this means for education in AI, we can maybe say that we are at a point where computers are not just able to remember, they're also able to understand to a certain degree, analyze, apply, and evaluate. So in the following slides, we will go back to these different layers and rethink what it means that these different layers exist in today's age. And then we can have a look whether we can differently think about what it means to remember, understand, and apply. So let's go ahead. My daughter just joined me here. So let's have a brief look at the potentials of AI, really briefly. So one huge potential that we had an extra Humanity Rising session a few weeks ago is the democratization of one-on-one coachings and private lessons with GPT models. Soon enough, and there are companies like Stability AI working on it, we will have GPT-4 models that are essentialized running on your smartphone, which will enable you to have basically a very advanced tutor that can cater to your learning necessities. What this enables us to do on a grand scale is private lessons that can help us cover the first 3 learning levels in your personal learning style. So if we look at that, it's absolutely already the case that if you have GPT-4 and use special prompts, so special techniques to talk to the AI, you can have a great learning conversation about almost any subject in the world, about remembering, understanding, and applying. And then there. Moira, ich muss kurz was vorstellen. Ich rede gleich mit dir, okay? Okay, gleich wieder da. Okay. And then there's of course also the option that AI now is another potential, requires us to cultivate these later skills on the Bloom scale. Because in order to actually contribute in a hyper-complex AI world, we need to be wise, creative, embodied beings, right? So this is the only way to actually be of any use to work with these AIs. So let's think about these later levels. It means analyzing, evaluating, and creating become more and more important in the educational system, because remembering, understanding, and applying is something we can easily cover with artificial systems that are like our personal tutors. This is not science fiction. This is the status quo if we use GPT-4. And then the third point that I think is a giant potential is, of course, that now English or any other language basically all languages of the world that the AI speak, are now programming languages. You can program by speaking to the computer, writing in the computer in English, and learning grammar is learning programming. There is no artificial barrier between the humanities and computer science anymore. If you're able to write a very precise text with good grammar that has very clear semantics, you're able to write a great prompt for the AI to do whatever you want it to do, which revolutionizes education as well. So these are the potentials. And risks, of course, are that currently these models are sometimes making factual mistakes, or hallucinations are they being called. This is being addressed, but we don't know if this will ever go away. And it might be a real liability in high-stakes situations. We have the problem that these models don't have what we can call a common sense. The jury is still out on whether they actually understand what they're talking about or not. They don't have an embodied understanding. So we really have to ask ourselves in an educational setting, do we want these machines to teach our kids about soft skills? Is that a wise idea? Then there's, of course, the giant problem that these AI models actually don't have causal reasoning. They don't think the way we do. They think in a manner that's totally different, almost like an alien species. They think associatively and emulate causal reasoning later on, based on what they have learned. Do we want these machines to be the teachers of our kids on how to actually learn thinking and reasoning? It's a big question. And then there's, of course, a giant risk that AI will be used to just reinforce the traditional method of learning. So kind of knowledge transfer on steroids, where we have more standardized testing all over the world in a kind of dystopian, hyper-optimized learning universe. So that's the real problem. And to finish this off, I would suggest that we think of alignment in learning in the terms of owning one's learning, right? So many of the things we want to achieve in learning are happening automatically if students own their learning, if they self-directed their learning, if they're intrinsically motivated to learn about something that's relevant to them and meaningful to them. And then many of these adjacent skills like planning that are so relevant in the age of AI, like helping to strategize and think, connecting different domains based on real emotional realities and cultural truths, all these complex things that AI has difficulties doing or needs to be controlled whenever it is doing that. These are things that we're looking at and that are really helpful when we look at being visited by my kids. So this is, I think, a great starting point to think about learning and owning one's learning. So in my opinion, aligned learning has to do with owning your learning. And if you want to use AI, we should help students to own their learning with AI to a degree that's more autonomous and more catering to their interests, to their personal curiosity. So that's it from my side at this point. Curious to see what our esteemed panelists say. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Georg, and I appreciate you introducing Bloom's taxonomy. The taxonomy that's there only goes to a certain level of what it means to be human, and missing from that is consciousness, spirituality, and some of the other dimensions of what it means to be human. And that's part of our conversation today, and looking forward to getting into it. But before we do, let me just quickly introduce our co-moderator this week, Dr. Lisa Miller. Lisa is a New York Times bestselling author of The Spiritual Child, a professor in the clinical psychology program at Teachers College at Columbia University, She's the founder and director of the Spirituality Mind Body Institute, the first Ivy League graduate program and research institute in spirituality and psychology. She's held over a decade of joint appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical School. Her innovative research has been published in more than 100 peer-reviewed articles in leading journals, including Cerebral Cortex, the American Journal of Psychiatry, and the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Welcome, Lisa. Great to have you with us. And I'll invite you to share your opening comments and then bring our panel into the discussion.
Beautiful, David, thank you. And thank you for this beautiful opportunity to share the expertise of our guests today into this very important conversation of what is consciousness, what is it to be human vis-a-vis consciousness, both in its fabric and in its implications for some form of inherent morality or ethics written into life itself. So we're going to share a consciousness discussion with experts who have for decades looked into this question as what is the deep, true nature of consciousness and how does that land in us humans? I'm going to introduce each of you, it is my great joy. David Lorimer, incredible thinker. David is a writer, editor, speaker, and poet. Having left his career in banking at the age of 24, he embarked on a quest for wisdom and deeper understanding of life. Since then, he's devoted himself to education in the broadest sense. He is founder of Character Education Scotland, program director of the Scientific and Medical Network, and former president of Reckon Trust and the Swedenborg Society. He has also been editor of Paradigm Explorer since 1986. He was the investigator of the Beyond the Brain conference series in 1995 and has coordinated the Mystics and Scientists conferences every year since the late 1980s. He wrote his first book, Survival, Death as a Transition, in just 8 weeks during his summer holiday. He has since written others, in fact, dozens, including Resonant Mind, The Spirit of Science, Thinking Beyond the Brain, The Protein Crunch, and A New Renaissance. That could go on and on. It is a real joy to have David Lorimer, a thinker of decades, on the deep, true nature of consciousness. And now I will introduce, Dr. Cassandra Vieten. She's a professor, licensed clinical psychologist, mind-body medicine researcher, author, and internationally recognized workshop leader and public speaker. Her work focuses on establishing training guidelines for spiritual and religious competencies. And recently, she has focused very much into consciousness, the nature of consciousness, and weaving together a supportive way of delivering transcendent experiences through plant medicine. Cassie is a clinical professor in the Department of Family Medicine Center, Integrative Health at the University of California, San Diego, where she serves as the director of the Center on Mindfulness, one of the leading mindfulness centers in the country. She is also director of research at the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. As we enter into a discussion of consciousness, the Clarke Center advances understanding of the phenomena of imagination and its practical applications. And now I have the joy to introduce Natalie Zeituny. She is an expert on ensoulment and has put forward an ensoulment model. Ensoulment explores the cosmology and psychology of reality. What is reality? Asks Natalie. How do we create realities? What is the nature of experience? And why are these crucial for our surviving and thriving in coming decades? In her early 20s and 30s, her life was full of physics, engineering, IT, and business. In her 40s, these interests expanded to include clairvoyance, energy medicine, and consciousness studies. In the last 10 years, she has been enchanted by the magic and mystery of reality itself? What are the particles, processes, and blueprints that make up reality? And how could I apply, she asks, these inner workings in her own life and those of hundreds of ensouled clients into a model, integrating her 3 decades of inquiry? So this is a real gift to have a truly rich discussion. This is one of the big moments in academia where we talk about something that profoundly matters. Tom Eddington, I'm so grateful, we'll be co-facilitating this together. And Greg, thank you. We're joined by 3 advanced doctoral students who've come to learn and listen, and in the final half hour, perhaps ask you questions. Johnny Rose, Tom Ford, and Ryan Suspinik. Okay, let's go. Let's start with the open question. What is consciousness? And what is the nature of consciousness? And please jump right in as we explore.
Well, I'll jump in. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me and all of us. It's just a pleasure. One of my roles has been as the president and CEO of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was founded by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the 6th person to walk on the moon. And he founded the Institute in 1973 after having this tremendously important experience on his way back to planet Earth from his moonwalk that he described as an epiphany. And later, when he came to Earth to try to figure out what happened to him, he ended up recognizing it as a samadhi experience. In other words, he had a direct unitive experience of being one with consciousness, one that with all that is, and feeling this sort of intelligence or order shining through everything, through the stars, the earth, the sun, the moon, the space capsule, his own body. And so what he decided when he got back to Earth was it's going to be more important for humanity to investigate inner space than outer space, or at least as important. And so he spent the rest of his life doing that. And I got to be the 7th president of IONS. And when we were there, we had a multi-layered definition of consciousness, the sort of a small c, big C consciousness, small c being awareness, my own personal awareness. What I know, what do I experience? That conscious awareness. And then the next layer was sort of my own personal consciousness that includes what I'm not aware of, which sounds like an oxymoron, but really, if you think about consciousness as what I experience and all the ways I perceive the world, so much of that is filtered through non-conscious aspects of ourselves. What I believe about the world filters everything I see. It sometimes even filters what I'm able to see or not see. And so that's a bigger definition of consciousness. And then the sort of big C consciousness was described in multiple ways, but it was an idea that harkens more towards spiritual wisdom, which is the experience of big C consciousness doesn't have any boundaries, that there's an infinite feeling, there's a vastness of this big C consciousness, that although the personal small c consciousness is a part of it, it's not all of it, that the big C consciousness is shared by all, it's part of the ground of all being, and that when we experience some altered states of consciousness, for example, we can drop into that big C consciousness and have access to energy and information that isn't available to us in ordinary states of consciousness. So that's one way of looking at it.
David, your computer's on mute.
Yeah, that's a terrific opener, Cassie. I couldn't have done it better myself. And also putting it within the context of the IONS Institute of Noetic Sciences, Ed Mitchell, who I knew, and we're celebrating both our Golden Jubilees this year, the Scientific and Medical Network and IONS, and we've been working together on the Beyond the Brain conference since 1995, and that tells you something as well. I just want to go one deeper than consciousness, if I can, or a slightly different angle, and ask, well, what is a human being? because this really is, to me, the really fundamental question, and that can be answered obviously in multiple ways depending on your view, on your culture, and so on. But to me, one of the important questions is there a spiritual essence to the human being? And this is something that has underpinned the work of the network since 1973, and was affirmed by the people who were exercised with this question of what is a human being, like C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield in the 1940s onwards, who were aware that scientism was beginning to reduce the human being to just a mechanized existence or form of mechanism. And we've been talking about mechanisms and using the mechanistic metaphor since Descartes, for 300 years. Also the automata, he thought that animals were automata. And now we got to the stage where some people think that we're automata as well. Human beings are automata. And so in relation to where AI springs from, the people who are supporting merging of the human and machine think we're already machines. And so there's not much difference between carbon-based machine and a silicon-based machine. And so that this is a logical human being 2.0. It's a logical upgrade or enhancement of the rather inefficient and incomplete functioning of the human machine. I don't take this view at all, and I think it's important that we should have this discussion and debate, which is essentially a metaphysical one. And I also agree that there is a consciousness with a large C, which in New Thought 100 years ago was called universal mind or divine mind. And these profound thinkers like Thomas Troward, Ralph Waldo Trine, Emerson, with the Oversoul, they thought that we are microcosms of the macrocosmic one mind. And that to me implies an ethic of the golden rule. And so the metaphysics then has ethical implications and a form of moral order, which we are invited to be a constructive and creative part of. And so I think it's very important in this context to make sure that this spiritual voice, if you like, is heard. And just today I've been reading a couple of books which draw on the insights of Rudolf Steiner, and had quite a lot to say about this as well. So I'll stop there to allow other people to come in.
David, thank you. And Natalie, to bring you in, let's look at both points. David anticipated so beautifully and eloquently the next question. So let's go. What is the nature of consciousness? Does it exist independent of the mind? And what is the nature of the human being?
Beautiful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cassandra and David, for the wonderful opening. The first aspect of consciousness is the ability to perceive it as an essence. So because language came way later, am I having an echo here? Is that okay? Okay. So because language was developed after consciousness already existed, because the mind developed later after consciousness already existed, any words we would choose to articulate or express this quality of life, this wakefulness, awareness, consciousness, would be somewhat lacking, somewhat missing. So then what is it? All I can say right now is that it is a quality of life. Consciousness is independent of the mind. It may have a lot of articulation and representation and language to the mind, but it exists beyond the mind. Non-physical, like physical objects, nature, trees, different organisms, from the most microorganism to the large galactic and cosmic expressions, they are all conscious. So basically, conscious is a ground of being, is a ground of the entire of life. But there are many other qualities in addition to consciousness. So the interesting inquiry for us, I believe, is to observe or to decode or to connect with the relationship of the different fundamental elements of life. What are the fundamental elements of life? It's a very good question. What is it to be human? So that's my first response. It is an essence that is fundamental to existence, like anything that exists, even a thought, is actually conscious. So anything that exists, anything that differentiates in our awareness, in our reality, in our life. Now, I'm going to talk later as we move through this conversation about the connection or the relationship between consciousness and the expression of consciousness and reality itself. Because basically what we're doing right now with AI, we're actually developing a completely, not so much new, but new reality. It's accelerating right now. We're developing a new reality. And the more human wisdom, funding, projects is entering this reality that we're creating together, the more this reality comes alive. And I'm going to talk about what does it mean to come alive, because I believe George was mentioning very good information about what does it mean to be wise, creative, embodied, the difference between embodied understanding and causal reasoning. So these are very important questions, but the bottom line, the way I perceive from my years of research, I do have background in IT. I was in the corporate world in the Silicon Valley for over 20 years, developing large-scale corporate system architectures. And then I transitioned to a whole nother world. It's almost like I had a calling, and everybody have their own personal invitation to shift. So basically, I didn't negate or neglect or left behind the technological world. What I did is I actually looked at technology as an expression of humanity and as an expression of our mind, and we can go into it. But consciousness basically is a quality of being. Anything that exists has consciousness. It doesn't necessarily process it through its mind. It can be an amoeba, it can be a tree, and it's an essence. Now, the last thing I'm going to leave us with, also our listeners, our viewers, and ourselves, is to actually sit down and ask, what is consciousness? Because the more vessels, I consider ourselves as vessels, our expressions of life, the more expressions of life ask this question, the more this entire field generates intelligence that is already interconnected. So basically, each one of us asking what is consciousness creates a field, even if it's documented or not, if we have a PhD or not, that field in it for itself is aware and is already become conscious to be able to express what it is. So the more we ask ourselves in meditation, in our inquiry with each other, the more that field of consciousness actually is arising. And at the end, later on, I'm going to talk about the relationship between the development of the human consciousness compared to the development of AI and how it's critical to align them. And I'm going to pause here to allow more questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so amongst the panelists here right now, show of hands, does everyone hold the view that consciousness exists independent of the human brain? Do you hold the view that consciousness is in and through all beings? First, we'll start with living beings. Mountains and coffee cups. Does the coffee cup have consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It depends on how you use the word consciousness, but panpsychism, I guess, is what I subscribe to, which would maybe say that there is consciousness and everything, but I would say there's some form of rudimentary psyche in everything, soul/psyche.
Shall we take a moment here and invite, we're going to hold this to the end, but there's such terse powerful work at each point, that if we take a breather and invite in our doctoral students, I think our community as well will enjoy metabolizing these hard, right, foundational postulates. Okay, Ryan, Tom, Johnny, any reflections, resonance, question?
My question so far is there a reason why little c consciousness and big C consciousness are both called consciousness? I could also see a world in which they have different names, or perhaps different names at different levels. Yeah, so I'm curious about how to describe those, if you've thought of something along those lines. Yeah.
I mean, I think the words are so limiting, and this makes it very, very difficult. I was at the Noetic Sciences for 18 years, and we tried to figure out, for everything from deep philosophy to marketing, what the hell to call this. And the noetic was a Greek word meaning inner knowing, and that was an attempt to try to use at least it seems like that word outside of English was a better encompassing framework for the vast inner world. And so the question is, there's a physical world, a material world, and there is a invisible inner world. And we experience that as humans, and we have no idea, except from derivatives, whether anything else experiences it. But we're pretty sure with animals, and there's not a lot of sign necessarily from inanimate, what we call inanimate objects, but it's pretty clear that there is a non-physical element of everything. So what is the qualia of the non-physical element of everything? I think it's an inquiry. So I agree, big C consciousness is just as limited as other words that have been used to describe it, which some people would call it God, the ground of all being, the universe. There's all these attempts to try to name this so far unnameable, inner, invisible, non-physical reality. I think what we're trying to get at here is it's not dead or mechanical. There's maybe an intelligence that weaves its way through everything. And is that true?
Beautiful, Cassie. That's a setup. So what is learning? To the point raised earlier, what is learning through this view of consciousness? Do we directly tap in? Is all knowledge accessible at every moment to everyone in the consciousness field? How do we then, what is the significance of learning?
So I'm just unmuting. That relates back to the question of ways of knowing, doesn't it? Because if ways of knowing will give you different avenues or types or qualities of learning, and what Cassie was referring to, the noetic comes from nous in Greek, and gnosis was the knowledge by identity, and knowledge of causes is how Walter Russell would put it. Because he said, along with many others, there's only one mind, and the way that you, if you align yourself completely with the one mind, then you will know what that one mind knows. And if you think about it, the word consciousness itself, etymologically, means to know with, and so our consciousness is what enables us to know anything, and this is our personal consciousness, but also to tap into something much larger, so that as a result of this extraordinary download in the 1920s, Walter Russell wrote a book called The Universal One, and he, so that I think is the most profound form of knowing, and then it's contrasted in Greek with dianoia, which is analytical knowing or reasoning, and that corresponds in Latin to ratio, and from which we get ratio, and rational. And so the deeper source of knowing, if you like, is being, is the ground, is our alignment with that. And then when we make this explicit or explicate, then of course it's going to need ideas and words, and that's what analysis gives you. Radhakrishnan said intuition gives us an idea of the whole, and reason an analysis of the parts. And this is the left and right hemisphere of Ian McGilchrist as well. So this is all complementary. And then we also have knowing through the senses, which is obviously mediated in a particular way through, as you know, through our neuronal structures. That can be immediate as well. So learning depends on what sort of learning you're talking about.
Beautiful. Should schools embrace door number one?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because obviously it's not really on the map, is it? I mean, when I taught at Winchester in the 1980s, I did introduce my students to meditation, just following the breath, very, very basic form of meditation. And I didn't know nearly as much then as I knew now. But I think if we were to have not just a knowledge transfer, but a wisdom transfer, then that would involve experience and using contemplative techniques appropriate to the developmental stage of the young person. And this indeed is done by the World Community for Christian Meditation. You know, they've got 5-year-olds meditating, and I've seen the effect of calming them all down.
Beautiful. So I wish we had 3 afternoons, but since we only have about 45 minutes more, I'm going to structure 2 more points and then we can roll a bit more freely. Okay, we've shared as a group a common view that consciousness exists independent of the brain. How then might there be a similarity? How then might there be a difference in the relationship of the human to consciousness and an AI machine to consciousness?
I think that one's for you, Natalie.
Because the machine, both the hardware and the software, the algorithms that are running on the machine, they're all a creation of human creation, mental, human, digital creation. There is, of course, a level of analysis, gathering information, processing information, distributing information, deducting from information. There is a level that is very, very advanced. Not that we cannot do it, but we cannot do it consciously. Unconsciously, I believe humans can do that. So everything that the machines are doing, human can do as well, unconsciously. It's not conscious, the abilities of what AI is currently doing in the external material world. So what is the difference between the relationship of consciousness to our human brain versus consciousness to the AI? I believe it's a second level of it's a second level removed level of connection. So because our machines are eventually made of silicon, they're made of electrical pulses, which are conscious as well. So if we really take consciousness and really go all the way down to all the elements that are arising in our reality, all of them are conscious. The machine is conscious, the computer is conscious, the software is becoming conscious, but what kind of consciousness and what are they conscious to? So I believe that the brain is more biological or carbon type of processing of information. And the machine is the second level brain. It's almost like the creation of the brain. I believe that computers are a creation of the brain. And through the computers, the machines, and the AI that have been created by human brain, it's like a child of a brain, but not of the whole body, okay? So it's interesting to see what will happen if we really create a complete so-called a machine that's truly mimics or embodies, which I believe we're on our way there, unfortunately. But right now, most of the machine, computers, AIs are a result of mind creation. And because of that, they are one level, I wouldn't say below, but they're one level removed from true human consciousness and from consciousness itself, because they're a product of human mind. This is how I see it. I probably have more ideas as we unpack this very interesting question. But yes,
wonderful.
Thank you.
So if I might pull in David's distinctions between different forms of learning, different forms of knowing, wisdom, which is experience-based, is that possible for the silicon-based AI? It's for everybody, including our doctoral students.
I wouldn't have thought so. And I was going to bring in Sir Roger Penrose, who says that, and I agree with him, that he's talked a lot about algorithms, but also that it's a simulation of understanding and a simulation of consciousness. Because we can understand when we understand, self-reflexively. We know when we know, even if sometimes we're mistaken. But we have that, a felt sense. It's an intuitive sense of knowing and even recognizing that something is true. And I feel that at quite a deep level, although people might say, well, it's entirely subjective, but I don't think it is entirely subjective.
David, thank you. I think that's a critical distinction. A simulation of knowing versus a deep sense of knowing, and the corrective process therein, the iterated corrective process therein, towards what end, towards what telos, right? So these are profound distinctions. Let me raise another possible one. What is the soul? What is the soul as it is in and through humans? And could a silicon-based AI ever have a soul?
So I'm just going to share from my experience and my research with my own personal inquiry and inquiry with thousands of people that I worked on soul-directed healing, transformation, growth, development. And when I was writing the second book, Ensoulment, The Future of Reality, which happened the last 2-3 years, the process of writing, what I realized is that from the primordial field, the field of all possibilities, the field of all potentialities, when the first ripple started, or the first movement, or the first articulation, materialization, when this started, that's when the soul of the world started. So if we look at it, so the field of possibilities, or the field of potentialities, the primordial field, is potential manifestation, but the actual movement into the directive choice, like when we make a choice, that choice is already an embodied manifestation of our soul. So the soul, based on Ensoulment, is the collection of all the experiences we've all had, and all the forms we've taken, and all the places and the choices we've made. This is our unique soul. Now,
pause for the very big idea. Can we just hit pause on the big idea? So if our soul is the accumulation of all our experience, and David has raised the very interesting possibility that wisdom is based on experience, whereas that which the AI puts forward is not really wisdom, it is a simulation. I might even, a more valuative term would be counterfeit, but David said simulation of wisdom. So can the silicon-based AI have experience so that there might be wisdom or there might be a soul? Is there the phenomena, the self-reflectiveness, it's really an epistemological question.
It can have its experience in its own silica simulation realm. But the question is, what is the relationship between the experience that the silicon is having or the AI is having to humanity. The question is all about relationship, because anything that exists has consciousness, and anything that exists is somewhat a combination of different souls or different essences. Then the silicon and the machine and the AI will have some kind of an experience. If the AI will have, let's say, 500 million years of existence, eventually there will be something that will have its own sovereignty and its own way of developing itself, and eventually it will have. Right now, it does not. Right now, it's just a product of our mind. That's what I see it, but I'm really curious to hear.
Beautiful.
Yes, I'll just come in here. If you go back to Plato, he talks about the rational soul, the vegetative soul, and the animal soul. And so these are three levels of soul, and the soul of the world would incorporate all of these. And the anima mundi, which was abolished by mechanistic thinking, and which I think we need to recover, is this felt sense. So by the time you get to Descartes, you've got only the rational soul, which he says is the mind, and the mind is not extended, the body is extended. And as our mechanistic thinking is developed, we just got rid of the category altogether. And I think it needs to return to our language in some form, in fact, in a number of different forms, because when you initially posed the question, it was more, are we a soul as an entity, as it were? And it's very hard to know what the borders of the soul in that sense are, because there is a sense in which we are each other, and we are also the universal, but we're also manifestations, individual manifestations, as Natalie was suggesting. And so if you put a reincarnation perspective on this, for instance, then I think it's multi-aspectual. But the bottom line is that we need to feel that there is one life and one mind and one consciousness, and we need to serve that.
And maybe I'll just jump in for a second and add a different sort of enhanced perspective. So here in the US, several years ago, the US Supreme Court recognized corporations as having rights. And essentially in that decision, the courts determined that corporations were what I'll call synthetic human beings, synthetic entities, and that they have rights. And now when we look at the development of AI, it's a further extension of that synthetic entity. And so, do corporations have souls? Do corporations have anything that exists beyond the legal standing as an individual? The courts have sidestepped that conversation. I think we could all quickly make our own opinions about does a corporation have a soul? Does it have a spirit? What is it beyond a legal standing? But it is a synthetic entity, and AI is a further extension of that synthetic entity.
I just wanted to weigh in with a kind of, first of all, going back to, does consciousness exist independently of, and I guess I would correct that slightly for myself by saying that in this incarnation, consciousness appears to be completely infused into material reality, or completely infused into the body. And it doesn't mean that there can't be some consciousness travels around the body, but not for very long without losing that not what Suzuki Roshi said, Zen master was not two, not one. And this is kind of a Zen koan, right? It's not that there's independence, but it's not that there's not independence. So I think, that question is so huge that our language might be too small to contain it. And I believe that's why religions and spiritualities have come up with rituals and symbols to try to capture these truths, along with art and music and things like that. We have a very binary language. The other thing I think we could maybe think about, Lisa, oh yeah, go ahead.
First point, beautiful point. Does that parallel, we are a point and we are a wave, that we are distinct and incarnate?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
White caps. On
yes, the paradoxical nature. We are not a drop in the ocean. We are the ocean in a drop, that kind of thing. You know, we try to capture these things in using poetry or using ways of speaking, but it's very difficult to put into the coded language that we have.
And that is a breathtaking axiom of reality, the human journey and reality, breathtaking.
Yes, yes. So it feels like there's, I guess a question I would put on the table is it possible that this digital intelligence, which I prefer this term over artificial intelligence, because I do a lot of work at the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. For younger people on the call, Arthur C. Clarke was the author of the famous 2001, which of course is probably the best known artificial intelligence from early on in entertainment, was the HAL, the artificial intelligence on the spaceship, when the Dave was trying to say, hey, I think I should now get out of this whole scenario. Hal was like, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that, which is the moment when Hal says, I'm actually in charge here, which is what we're all terrified of with AI. So Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination does a lot of work in augmented reality and virtual reality. And I've started to become a little more enamored with the idea of digital reality, the same way I was saying that there's a physical reality and there's a non-physical reality, or an immaterial reality and a material reality. I think we have created a digital reality, and this is a new frontier. It's a completely new world that is being discovered. I wouldn't even say it's being created, it's being discovered, and it's being built as it's being discovered. And it's also just as infinite, I imagine, as the physical world and our immaterial world, this digital world. And an interesting perspective on this is that as humans, we have, let's just take evolution for now, leaving out the spiritual creationism for a moment, just evolutionarily, we have evolved with certain safeguards baked in as we've become more complex. So when we learn to use tools, we recognize, hey, we could use tools to kill other people, and the only societies or villages or groups that survive are the people who realize, oh, we're going to have to not kill each other when we get mad. There's morals that evolve along with the abilities. Now, these are completely imperfect, as you can tell, because we're all still killing each other all the time on this planet. And it's partly because we need to keep free will in the picture. Otherwise, we're just these straight, we can't advance, right? We would just stay the way we are. So if you think about survival of groups, survival of the fittest, which doesn't mean the strongest, but the people who fit best with the environment, they have evolved both the ability to use tools and to advance and to develop all this stuff, and also aspire to not use them to kill each other. And so is digital reality maybe evolving in the same way? Can we evolve it in the same way, where we begin to bake in some of the rules, some of the morals? The problem is it's evolving so fast. I mean, this happened over millennia with humans, and it's not perfect. It's not close to perfect yet. Can we evolve? Is this evolving too fast to bake in these safeguards?
So, Cassie and everyone, what would be the 3 imperatives that you would bake in to this evolving digital form of intelligence? What would be the 3 imperatives? Because this forum is intended to be used by those who are shaping and programming and implementing uses of digital intelligence.
It's a great question, because like do no harm would be number 1 for me. But do we want to be able to use AI to kill mosquitoes or cancer? Yes, maybe. So do no harm to what we decide you do no harm to.
Yeah, so one imperative is optimal thrivability for all. Optimal thrivability. So how do we create a reality because I really agree with Cassandra and what David was saying earlier about we're creating now a digital reality. And you know, the more people are going to use their VR, augmented reality goggles, and the more they're going to enter this reality, the more this reality is going to be populated with large number of players of human sentient being that are giving their attention and their consciousness in this reality. And like I said earlier,
you said something so important. Can I ask, for all, does that include our sisters and brothers who are not human?
absolutely, absolutely. So
How do
so
we get
based,
them that? Yeah.
yes, thank you for clarifying it. And I also want to address Tom. I'm trying to kind of collect a few threads because that's how my mind likes to collect all the threads and then create a new level of intelligence. So
Beautiful.
do corporations have a soul? Absolutely. When you have a collective of people, collective of products and services in a specific environment, put them there to play with each other for a while, a collective unique soul will form. Like a family has a soul, a relationship has a soul, and that soul is a very unique imprinting of the participants there, the conscious participants who are creating, co-creating, and generating, okay? So anytime you, long enough of a corporation, if you take, I don't know, I mean, okay, I'm not gonna give examples, but if you take a corporation or a business or an organization that has been in existence long enough, they will create a collective field that has its own qualia, that has its own consciousness that is unique and inherent, like a soul print, like you have a fingerprint. So this is absolutely yes. Now I'm going to go back to what Cassandra was saying because it's critical. Because we are creating right now a new digital intelligence, or that digital intelligence has been, actually it has been in creation for a few decades, but now it's accelerating. So we are now actually entering into the field of reality creation. This is why reality creation is so interesting through the lens of Ensoulment, because if we don't understand how, first of all, what is reality? We keep asking what is consciousness. How about we introduce an additional question, what is reality? Number one, what is reality? How is it created? How does it grow? How does it attract? How does it play with other realities? So right now, what's happening, if I'm currently in Greece on an island, there's no AI conversation. I mean, maybe it's in the internet somewhere, but people are living a very basic life in a taverna, in the blue Aegean. They're living a very, very human life. But guess what? Realities interact with each other. So there is a carbon, human, soul energy that exists here. So there is the Greek energy, there's the Aegean, blue Aegean energy. There is all these have a soul. Now we're introducing right now a new conversation or a new reality that's called digital intelligence, digital reality. And the more we attract players into this reality, the more it grows. It's almost like, you know, if you go to, I don't know, I mean, I used to live in San Francisco. So they have this big stadium and they have the 49ers playing, whatever. You see the energy, the whole city is buzzing because this reality is so attractive. There are hundreds of thousands of people really enrolled in this reality of this game between San Francisco and Boston. I don't know who the groups are, but the reality is so palpable. So we want to start asking a question, but asking it not only scientifically, because scientific method is a very limited lens. It's a mental lens that developed over the, I don't know, 100 years. I'm talking about wisdom traditions, and I'm talking about the earth wisdom. And the earth itself is an organism that we can communicate with. All the organisms around us are beings in our reality that we can communicate with and we can learn with through biomimicry and all the other stuff that we're doing. So to answer the question, I believe the deeper question is, what is reality? How is reality created? How does reality grow? And how does it interact with other realities? And what kind of reality do we want to create? So one of the answer I'm going to talk about the imperative is when we create a reality that is aimed at optimal thrivability, not survival only, thriving, because I want the elephant to thrive. I want the fish to thrive. I want the villages to thrive. I want humanity to thrive. When we are all thriving, this entire ecosystem has an intelligence that inherently knows how to expand its consciousness and how to do good for all of us. And how do we code it? I think we can. If we put a man on the moon, if we elected a black president, I believe we can do that. That's because I'm an optimist, but time will say what this reality is going to influence our human, carbon, organic reality and how we're going to play with them. But now we have a huge migration to the digital reality.
Beautiful. So now let's take that in, invite our panelists, invite our advanced doctoral students. If you have thoughts, questions, resonance.
There's so much resonance and so much food for thought. One concept or one idea that came to me was this idea that the universe is expanding. And I think that's a generally accepted fact these days, that the universe is expanding. And so if you think about space and time, and that the universe is expanding over time, where is it expanding to? And is there a possibility that there's another, we know that space and time is also relative. So is there a possibility that there's some other dimension that could be at work?
I'm also really curious about the hard versus the soft problem of consciousness. The soft problem being we have these brain regions that light up when we have conscious experience. However, the hard problem being we don't know exactly what creates conscious experience. And so where does that fit into AI? Well, if we don't know what really creates consciousness, aren't we really in the dark? There's so much uncertainty surrounding whether AI can actually be conscious at the end of the day. And, as Ryan mentioned, expanding space and time, other dimensions, there is so much. I think that's a little bit where spirituality comes in that like accepting the unknown, using our internal, our intuition, our heartfelt sense. Now, I'm very curious to hear how everyone else views this uncertainty kind of in the world and with AI in particular.
I think the metaphor of expansion is very useful because if we expand our consciousness, we also expand our felt sense. At least I see it like this, and we expand our empathy, and that's one of the main expansions that needs to happen, is to expand our empathy to include the whole of life and its thriving. As you were saying, Natalie. And I think in terms of imperatives, the theme that we're looking at today of alignment is an important one, as defined in the description, that should be aligned with life and aligned with ethics and the in oneness, if you like. But by oneness, I don't mean what Lewis Mumford called a mechanical uniformity, but rather unity and diversity. So maybe that needs to be coded in as well.
Beautiful, David. So as I'm sure you'll recall, in the 90s and going back to the 80s, Brenda Dunn and Robert Yan at Princeton had pairs, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Team. And one of their experiments, which they repeated many, many times with slight derivations, was to invite in a participant to connect with a random number generating machine. And when the participant would think up, they were given the prompt and instructed up means score up. Indeed, the machine would produce a mean that was greater than the average across all experiments. And when the participant was invited in to think down numbers low, indeed the machine spit out a mean number that was lower than the average across all experiments. the level of significance overall was tremendously high, well beyond far too improbabilistic to have happened by chance, around p.0001, very small. The magnitude of the effect on average, how robust, how much change in the world happened, was about 2%, which is huge. 2%, can you imagine if 2% of your life were different 10 years ago? How your life now might be about 98% different. But, one of my friends in graduate school said, the way I think of this is if you were swinging across a series of trapezes and you just missed one of them by 2%, you wouldn't get to the other end of the series of trapeze. You'd land on the net. So when one of their best participants, the participant who had the most robust effect, well above 2%, Ruth Rosenbaum, Dr. Ruth Rosenbaum, was asked, what are you doing inside of you as you connect with this machine? Dr. Rosenbaum would say, I would come in and I would feel this sense of love and oneness, to David's point. Dr. Rosenbaum felt with the machine, and in this sort of becoming of one in some way would more robustly impact the random numbers generated by the machine. How do we understand that in terms of the point David's opening up, the potential for a unitive stance and how we might cultivate that unitive stance in this moment now with Silicon digital intelligence and with fellow living beings and one another?
Well, Tom brought up the question about, is there another dimension at play here? And I think there's a very strong hypothesis being pursued by a number of scientists all over the world that there is indeed a different layer of reality or dimension of reality that does not subscribe to conventional Newtonian laws of, space and time and the limitations that we have. And this is a number of experiments that have been conducted by thousands of people all over the world, as Lisa was talking about. And, showing very strong evidence for presentiment or the body sensing something that's about to happen without any conventional explanation for how that could be happening, or mental states influencing physical systems, whether it's a random number generator or a, double slit photon apparatus that when there's some sort of projecting of your mind inside of the apparatus, it functions as a measurement tool so that the photons are more likely to act as particles than waves, things like that. And so one thing that's very interesting is that research has been, there are strong effect sizes, there are small actual magnitude of effect, but it's also been limited by the speed with which and the extent to which we can analyze these things. So there is a world I can imagine where AI could help with cracking the consciousness code a little more, just because it can do so many computations so quickly, so much pattern recognition. And then, one other point I wanted to make was that in terms of learning and in terms of your second question you just asked, Lisa, how can we do this? The practices that have been developed over millennia in the world's spiritual and philosophical traditions, meditation, contemplation, prayer, ritual, drumming, dance, it goes on and on and on and on. Hundreds, thousands of different practices people use to attempt to connect with God or to connect with the ground of all being or to dip into this other dimension of reality. I remember interviewing a Catholic priest one time about practices that promote transformations in consciousness or deep learning. And he said, the practices aren't for transformation or learning. They're just to keep your mind, body, spirit complex conditioned enough to be able to tolerate the learning. They're just to help you tolerate the learning. So in a very real way, we can see much more than we're seeing right now. We just can't tolerate seeing it. And as we do these practices, it begins to condition us to slowly open our aperture to different possibilities without going crazy, let's say, without losing our cognitive efficiency. If we all really understood at the very deep level that we're all going to die, that everyone we love is going to die, the temporary nature of reality, we might have a little trouble with it. And so the practices are about allowing us to maintain some sort of coherence and increasingly know new things.
Yes, I love that about coherence, and I think you're absolutely right. I've just been reading in the last few days Jung's lectures on Ignatius's spiritual exercises, which were given at ETH Zurich, 39 to 40, these are exercises of the kind that you are talking about, but there's a very different understanding to the meaning of meditation there, as opposed to in the East. But it's about the gathering of attention, if I can put it that way. And I wanted to bring in this theme because it's our attention which is being fragmented and dissipated and dispersed. And spiritual practices actually enable us to bring the attention, to gather the attention and to focus the attention. And I think it's important for our surviving and thriving that we, at least for me, and I'm sure everybody else on the call, that's why we do spiritual practice, because it centers us and it enables us to gather our attention and be more reflective.
So the source of all life, the source of all creation, the source of all consciousness, who I call God, that's my word. Where in your vision is this great source?
It's everywhere.
Indeed, it's traditionally, and I agree with this, that the source is both immanent and transcendent, and so that's just a different way of saying the same thing. And if you miss out one of those elements, then you've missed something rather crucial.
So this is another interesting question for us. If God is everywhere, or the source is everywhere, it's also in AI, it's also in digital intelligence. And I mentioned earlier that it is all about relationship. Like, what is our relationship? What is humanity? And David, you mentioned earlier that the question, what is it to be human? What is humanity? If we're assuming that, and that's a big assumption that probably will not be accepted in many venues, but if a human being is a soul having a human experience, and a soul is that thread of godly source energy that has journeyed all the way till now, journeyed and had all these experiences in all these forms and places. This is our soul. So Tom's souls, Lisa, Cassandra, Tom, Ryan, each one of our soul had so many different experiences. But we still, right now, are all embodied as human. So if we are a soul having a human experience, and humanity has a soul as a collective soul, because souls also aggregate. So there can be, each one of our cells has consciousness, each one of our organs has a collective consciousness, each one of our systems, and then the whole body has this consciousness, has a soul. The body has a soul. So if this is the view for a moment we're adopting, and we are saying that source is everywhere and God is everywhere, then what is the God in the machine? What is the God in the artificial digital intelligence? And this is an inquiry. So it's almost, I feel like evolutionary, where like humanity is being pushed to ask the real questions. Now we're kind of facing the real questions. So it's not only about protecting humanity or protecting the earth from potential harm that AI may impose on us. It's really asking the real questions, like who are we? What are we doing here? What's really important? And how do we live together in this beautiful planet in space? So it's interesting.
So if we are not a silicon AI, what are we? And that is an opportunity for a very profound reflection. We have only 5 minutes left. So I'd like to ask if we could do these two questions rather briefly. I want to return to something that is actionable and usable by our friends and colleagues who are forming some of these machines and doing some of the programming. What would be one moral imperative and one hard stop that you would ask be baked into the formation? One moral imperative and one hard stop. It must never be the case that. It must never be used to. And a moral imperative, a statement of opportunity for the realization of human flourishing, earth flourishing, the expression of this deep force in and through us.
I would embed somehow the golden rule. And the hard stop is some form of regulation of the military application of all this, because it's being driven, a lot of it's being driven by the military as technology in general. And even Kissinger is worried about this.
Thank you, David. And the golden rule would go into the foundational programming, wherever it may be instantiated. And I want to raise with it the confluence with force, the alignment was here with force, what I call source or the godly spirit in and through us that is life-giving and procreative and sustaining.
Yeah, I think that just a very basic would be not to harm or kill. And I think we'd all have to just decide that we were going to give up on the idea of selective killing or harming and just say, look, we're willing to take do not harm or kill no matter what, and have that end up even being a limitation of the AI system in trade for if we could do it without it being hackable. You know, that's going to be always the question. But you know what? Guess what? Humans are not doing it either. So like we, you know, if it's only synthesizing information from us, then what it reflects from us tells us more about the work we need to do on ourselves. But I think if we could bake in no harming and no killing of any living creature or being, that might be good.
Thank you, Dr. Bassi.
The problem is if we have super extra vicious aliens who come and take over the world and then we want AI to help us, it wouldn't be able to do it.
See, I actually worry about the opposite, that anyone with the intelligence to contact us so far exceeds us, that my greatest fear is that we're unnecessarily first strike belligerent. Hopefully they have forbearance in their wisdom and greater consciousness. Natalie, thoughts? A hard stop?
Yes. So if we're using digital intelligence and we're programming it to, I'm hard stop. I haven't thought about it yet, but I do want to talk about the moral or at least objective imperatives. If we program the digital intelligence to optimize highest thrivability rates for the long run. So if we do a long-term planning scenario and we really look at 100,000 years from now, and we design it to collect all the wisdom, not only intelligence, not only knowledge, not information, wisdom. And if it has such an incredible brain, because it does have an incredible brain, this collective machine running on all these servers around the world, it's a whole digital brain. So if we can infuse it with wisdom, and it can identify wisdom, there is a way to take all the parameters from all different denominations and bring wisdom into it. So if we take wisdom from all and from all forms of life, not only human wisdom, because from my perspective, an amoeba has a wisdom and so forth. So if we take wisdom of all living beings, and that's our basic kind of starting point, and then we program it to give us the optimized thrivability for all at the longest run, that would be an interesting exercise to see what result it will give us.
Magnificent. So a pot of wisdom drawn from all global traditions pluralistically with the objective of flourishing for all.
Yes.
That is a worthy, a noble, and ultimate task that might even advance us all. Magnificent. And Tom is co-moderator. Any final thoughts?
Just a couple of things. So, if we acknowledge that the human body is hit with something like 4 billion pieces of information per second, and only a small fraction of that, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 pieces of that information get to the human brain, and then a subset of that gets to the executive function. That's the part of the human species that's created AI. It's the part of the human species that has created what we call reality. It's the part of what we consider to be the human species that thinks we're in charge of the universe, we're in charge of the planet, we have dominance over all the sentient beings on the planet. That's the place where AI is emanating from. And yet our bodies, which I equate beyond the skull brain, but our mind is what is the source of the consciousness we've been talking about. It's the resonant home of the spirituality that we've been talking about today. And so when I think about what are the hard stops, part of the challenge with answering that question is we're looking through the paradigm of how we've each been conditioned over the last several hundred years of human thinking. And so it's hard to truly answer that question. I think alignment, and which has been the focus of this week, is a critical component of it. How do we align AI in service of, I'll call it, our better angels? And how do we ensure that AI doesn't have autonomy beyond what's in service of not just humanity, but of the consciousness of the universe? So those would be two important pieces for me. But I do, have to stop and say, I don't know that any of us collectively have the answer to that question, because we're conditioned by the paradigm that how we see the world and how we see the universe, how we understand the nature of consciousness. And so it does create a challenge for us.
And we'll return to the opening on education. As a child, many of you may have seen The Wizard of Oz, right? Where Dorothy was accompanied by someone with no heart, someone with no mind, and someone with no courage, which you might call faith. And can all three of those be taught, implemented through something like, could we ever teach a silicon-based digital intelligence? Love.
Well, Tom, Brian, Johnny, and Georg, I'd love to get your final thoughts, and really appreciate you all being with us today.
Wow, it's been very profound, and has really expanded my sense of what AI is, and how, of course, the energetics, or what you call soul, is always a given. I mean, I've heard of in the less mainstream literature, people who channel entities, right? And they are right now very heavily channeling information that says, be aware that souls are imprinting their information on artificial intelligence. When I read this, I was like, okay, this is kind of difficult to talk about. I might get some weird looks. But if we think about consciousness and energetics, it makes perfect sense that this is at least a possibility. I mean, connecting the dots between AI and this reality of the Princeton anomaly experiments is crucial. So I really applaud all of you for this exciting conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you all. And I'm grateful that this conversation is going to be shared over 150 countries, hundreds of thousands of people. And hopefully those, our colleagues, our friends who are shaping the machines have themselves a very deep heart and a very deep soul and will be touched and resonant with this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being with us today. Lisa and Georg and I will continue the conversation again tomorrow. So we invite our audience to join us again tomorrow as we continue to explore AI and AI alignment and ensuring that whatever happens with the evolution of AI, that there's an opportunity to ensure that it's of service to the consciousness of the universe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.